Leave a like now, because what you are about to hear could completely change the way you interpret news about war, the global economy, and geopolitics, especially when it involves the United States and Iran. And stay until the end, because the most important part of this story is not what is being said, but what is being hidden behind the narratives. The United States and Iran are, at this moment, in one of the most delicate situations of recent years, with fragile negotiations, rising tension, and one detail that completely changes the game: there is no single interpretation of what is happening. On one side, American sources indicate that Iran is pushing for negotiations. On the other, political statements suggest the country is collapsing and trying to avoid an even worse scenario. But when you take a closer look, you realize the reality is far more complex. The first point to understand is that the idea of a ceasefire in this context is not simple. We are not talking about two countries in a traditional direct war, but rather a strategic dispute with indirect conflicts, economic pressure, military threats, and a parallel war of narratives. This means that even when ceasefire is mentioned, in practice there are multiple layers behind that word, and this is exactly where confusion begins. Different sides present different versions of the same movement, each serving a specific interest. Meanwhile, a piece of information starts gaining traction. Iran is reportedly studying US weapons through reverse engineering. This idea itself is not absurd. Historically, many countries have done this. China, for example, has used reverse engineering on various military technologies over time. Iran itself has previously analyzed captured drones, but the critical point is not the possibility, it's the confirmation. So far, there is no widely recognized validation from major international outlets that Iran has captured, in significant numbers and intact condition, weapons like GBU or BLU for full analysis. And that changed now. While this narrative circulates, a much more concrete movement is happening behind the scenes. Iran is intensifying its diplomatic relations. Visits to countries like Pakistan, Oman, and Russia are not random. They are part of a clear positioning strategy. The goal is simple yet highly effective: avoid international isolation, strengthen indirect alliances, and increase bargaining power. This is a classic pattern in pre-escalation or prolonged tension scenarios. At the same time, the country clearly defines its limits, its so-called red lines, including refusing to negotiate core issues like its nuclear program under certain terms. This positioning is not just diplomatic, it is strategic. It sends a direct message: we are willing to negotiate, but on our terms. And that puts pressure on the other side. Now comes one of the most important points of this analysis: the legal factor. Iran has begun using a highly relevant argument in the international arena. Its non-ratification of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this has enormous implications. While many countries follow this convention, which guarantees freedom of navigation in international straits, Iran argues it is not legally bound to comply with it. This creates a unique situation where the country can claim freedom of action in strategic areas like the Strait of Hormuz. And when we talk about this strait, we are talking about one of the most important routes on the planet, through which about 20% of the world's oil passes. In other words, any disruption there is not just a regional issue, it's an immediate global impact. And this is where narrative turns into real power, because it's not just about military capability, but about the ability to influence the global flow of energy. And in the modern world, energy is power. Meanwhile, political statements continue to fuel tension. The idea that one side is collapsing or desperate is part of a communication strategy. It does not necessarily reflect the full reality, but it helps shape public perception. And perception, in geopolitics, is almost as important as the fact itself, because it influences markets, political decisions, and because when you analyze it objectively, you see there are concrete elements, like diplomatic movements and strategic tensions. But there are also elements that have not yet been independently confirmed, and this mix creates an environment where information must be handled very carefully. Because if you react too quickly, you may be reacting to something that hasn't been fully validated yet. And this is one of the biggest challenges of today's world. The speed of information is greater than the speed of verification, and that creates a dangerous space where narratives can solidify before facts do. And that is exactly what is happening now. From the moment this tension gains global scale, it stops being just a regional conflict and starts influencing economic, political, and strategic decisions worldwide. And this happens because the center of this dispute is not just military, it is energetic, legal, and psychological. When Iran mentions its ability to interfere with the flow of energy, it is not just making a direct threat, it is activating a highly sophisticated pressure mechanism. Because the global market reacts not only to what happens, but to what could happen. And that means that even without an actual blockade, the mere risk can raise prices, create instability, and affect entire economies. Now another critical point comes in: strategic choke points. Strategic choke points. Strategic choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is already known as one of the main energy bottlenecks in the world, but there is another equally important point often mentioned in deeper analysis: the Bab el-Mandeb. This strait connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and is also vital for energy transport. And here it is important to make a technical clarification. Iran does not directly control this region. Those who operate there are local groups, such as the Houthis in Yemen, who have indirect alignment with Iran. This means any Iranian influence there would be indirect, not direct control. Even so, the potential impact is enormous, because if both points were affected, the effect on the global market would be immediate. And that is exactly what appears in recent political statements, not as a concrete action, but as a strategic possibility. Now, returning to the legal aspect, Iran's position creates an interesting situation. While some countries defend international navigation rules, Iran argues it is not bound by them. This creates a conflict of interpretation, where each side tries to validate its position within the international system. And this is not just a technical detail, it is a negotiation tool, because it allows Iran to justify its actions while pressuring other countries to respond. And this leads to an even more important point: the war of narratives. While one side tries to show strength and control, the other tries to show that the situation is under control or that the opponent is weakening. And this creates a scenario where truth is not singular, it is contested. And this dispute does not happen only between governments. It also happens in media, social networks, and public perception. And that amplifies the impact of every piece of information. Now, if you observe recent behavior, you see a clear pattern: increased rhetoric, intense diplomatic movements, use of legal arguments, and focus on strategic energy points. This does not necessarily mean a direct conflict will happen immediately, but it indicates that the level of tension is high. And historically, when multiple factors like these align, the risk of escalation increases. But there is an important detail: escalation does not mean inevitability, because while there is pressure, there is also an interest in avoiding a large-scale conflict. That is why negotiations continue, even indirectly. And this creates a paradoxical scenario: while public discourse becomes more aggressive, diplomatic channels remain open. And this shows that the real game is not just what is said publicly, but what happens behind the scenes. Markets react, alliances shift, political positions strengthen, and this shows that in geopolitics, there is rarely a single outcome. There are multiple layers of impact happening simultaneously, and understanding this is essential to avoid simplistic interpretations. Because the current scenario is not black and white, it is full of nuances, overlapping interests, and calculated decisions. And that is exactly what makes it more complex and more important to understand. When you put all these elements together, military tension, energy strategy, legal disputes, and narrative warfare, it becomes clear that what is happening goes far beyond a simple conflict between two countries. We are talking about a global power game, where every move is calculated and every piece of information can generate real consequences. The first point that must be reinforced is simple but fundamental. There is no absolute confirmation of many of the most viral elements, and this includes technical details about captured weapons or more extreme interpretations. In one areas nos D1s, it means cluster accuse about cap because that answer defines not only how you understand this scenario, but how you understand the world around you. Comment below what you think is really happening. I want to know your perspective. And if you want to keep understanding what is behind the news, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because that's how you stop being a hostage to superficial interpretations and start seeing the full picture.